There is an animal standing at the edge of a waterhole in the fading afternoon light, and it carries something inside its body that science is only beginning to read. It has been on this earth far longer than we assumed. Its family tree, which once appeared to be among the most orderly in the animal kingdom, has turned out to be something else entirely, fractured, layered, full of collisions and losses and improbable survivals. For generations, the story of where elephants came from seemed settled. The fossils were abundant. The timeline appeared coherent. The living species, 2 in Africa, 1 in Asia, seemed to represent the clean endpoints of a comprehensible journey through geological time. Then researchers began applying the tools of ancient genomics. And what they found was not confirmation. It was disruption. The elephant's past, it turns out, is not a clean line moving forward through millions of years. It is a record of populations that appeared, diverged, collapsed, merged, and vanished, leaving signals in the modern genome that no one fully expected to find. Signals that point toward extinct relatives who shaped the living world without surviving into it. Signals that suggest the 2 African elephant species, long treated as a recent divergence, may be separated by a gulf of time so deep it rivals the distance between humans and chimpanzees. And signals, most unsettling of all, that suggest some of what we thought was lost may not be entirely gone. This is not the story of elephants most of us were told. And the evidence that is rewriting it is stranger and more extraordinary than anyone predicted. For most of scientific history, the elephant's origin story was anchored in Africa. This was reasonable. The oldest proboscidean fossils, the broad group that includes elephants and all their extinct relatives, came from the African continent, primarily from sites in North and East Africa dating back more than 50 million years. The earliest members of this lineage were not elephants as we recognize them. They were smaller, diverse, and remarkably successful, a radiation of forms that would eventually give rise, over tens of millions of years, to the gomphithers, the mastodons, the stegodons, the mammoths, and eventually the true elephants of the genus Loxodonta in Africa and Elephas in Asia. The narrative that science assembled from this fossil record was orderly. Africa was the cradle. From there, proboscideans spread outward, into Europe, Asia, the Americas, diversifying into dozens of genera and species across millions of years of geological time. At the end of this long radiation stood 3 survivors: the African bush elephant, the African forest elephant, and the Asian elephant. These 3, the story said, were the inheritors of an ancient lineage now reduced to its final representatives. Their relationships to each other, and to their extinct relatives, seemed well understood. The African bush elephant and the African forest elephant had long been grouped as a single species, or treated as closely related subspecies. The Asian elephant was considered their somewhat more distant cousin. The woolly mammoth, meanwhile, was understood to sit closer to the Asian elephant than to either African species. This was the family tree. It looked stable. It looked final. Except that the morphologists, the scientists who study physical form and structure, had been raising quiet concerns for years. The 2 African species did not simply look different. They looked profoundly different. The African forest elephant, smaller and more rounded in its features, with straighter, downward-pointing tusks and distinctly shaped ears, bore a suite of physical characteristics that did not map cleanly onto the bush elephant's anatomy. Researchers who studied skull morphology and skeletal proportions noted that the differences between the 2 African species were, in some respects, as pronounced as the differences between either of them and the Asian elephant. But the genetic tools available at the time could not fully resolve the question. The available mitochondrial data suggested the 2 African species were more closely related to each other than either was to the Asian elephant, and that seemed to settle it. It did not settle it. What the mitochondrial data was showing was only one thread of inheritance. And that thread, it turned out, was telling a very different story from the rest of the genome. Mitochondrial DNA is inherited exclusively through the maternal line. It passes from mother to offspring without the shuffling and recombination that affects the rest of the genome. This makes it useful for tracing certain lineages, but it also means it can be deeply misleading when populations have complex histories involving hybridization, admixture, or incomplete lineage sorting. When two populations split, the mitochondrial lineages within them do not immediately separate cleanly. Ancient variation persists. And if those populations later come back into contact and interbreed, even briefly, even partially, the mitochondrial signal can end up painting a picture of relationship that the rest of the genome does not support. This is precisely what researchers began to suspect was happening with elephants. When whole genome sequencing was applied to the 3 living elephant species, comparing not just the maternal line but the full autosomal genome, the billions of base pairs inherited from both parents across every chromosome, the picture changed dramatically. The story did not collapse. It widened into something far more complicated and far more extraordinary. The most striking finding involved the relationship between the 2 African species. When researchers analyzed their full genomes, the divergence between the African forest elephant and the African bush elephant turned out to be substantially deeper than the mitochondrial data had implied, deep enough, some analyses suggested, that the 2 species had been evolving separately for somewhere between 2 and 5 million years. That places their split not in the recent past, not as a product of habitat fragmentation during the last ice age, but potentially in the deep Pliocene, a time when the human lineage had barely begun to diverge from its own closest relatives. That was not a minor revision. That was a reorientation of the entire timeline. If you find that kind of deep time discovery as compelling as we do, subscribe, because the further we look into the ancient genome, the more the accepted story has to give way. And the forest elephant's story did not stop there. It grew stranger. When researchers positioned the forest elephant in the broader context of the elephant family tree, comparing it not just to the bush elephant and the Asian elephant, but to genomic data recovered from extinct species including the woolly mammoth and the American mastodon, they found something that the old phylogenies had not prepared them for. In certain genomic analyses, the African forest elephant appeared to sit in a position of unusual isolation, not simply as a sister group to the bush elephant, but as something older, something that had been diverging on its own trajectory for a period of time that placed it in a category of distinctiveness that rivaled the deepest separations in the proboscidean tree. The question this raised was one that researchers have been cautious about answering too quickly. But the question itself is impossible to ignore. 3 explanatory frameworks have emerged to account for what the genome is revealing, and none of them alone closes the case. The first is a deep divergence model. Under this interpretation, the African forest elephant and the African bush elephant are not merely different species, they are ancient lineages that parted ways millions of years ago and have been accumulating genomic differences ever since. The similarity that older analyses detected was, under this reading, a product of shared ancestral variation and the limitations of mitochondrial data, not of genuine closeness. The 2 animals shared a continent and, occasionally, geography, but not a recent common ancestor in any meaningful evolutionary sense. This would make the forest elephant one of the most genomically distinct large mammals on Earth, and one of the most urgently in need of recognition as irreplaceable. The second framework invokes admixture, the genomic signal left when previously separated lineages come back into contact and interbreed. Some researchers have proposed that the pattern of genetic similarity between the 2 African species, and between African and Asian elephants in certain parts of the genome, cannot be explained by the branching tree model alone. There may have been contact events, ancient meetings at the boundaries of forest and savanna, or during periods of climate-driven habitat expansion, that introduced genes from one lineage into another, creating a mosaic signal that the simple tree structure cannot capture. Under this view, living elephants may be carrying the genomic echoes of meetings between lineages that the fossil record has not yet fully documented. The third framework is perhaps the most unsettling. It involves what population geneticists call ghost lineages, ancestral populations that contributed DNA to living species without surviving into the present in any recoverable form. When researchers analyzed the genomes of living elephants against the backdrop of ancient proboscidean sequences recovered from permafrost and cave sites, they found statistical residuals, portions of the genome that did not fit cleanly into the known family tree. The data may indicate that one or more entirely uncharacterized elephant lineages contributed genetic material to the ancestors of modern species sometime in the distant past, Populations that left no fossils we have yet identified, no living descendants, only a faint signal embedded in the genome of animals that are still alive today. The landmark evidence that crystallized these debates came from a series of studies applying ancient DNA recovery techniques to proboscidean remains, mammoth molars, mastodon bones, and remarkably preserved specimens from permafrost sites in Siberia and North America, combined with high-coverage whole genome sequencing of all 3 living elephant species. The breadth of the comparison panel was what made the difference. Earlier studies had compared living species to each other. These studies compared living species to their deep-time relatives, and the result was a phylogenetic picture with far more complexity, far more ancient branching, and far more evidence of reticulation, of lineages crossing and mixing, than anyone had modeled before. The most consequential finding was not about mammoths, though the mammoth data was extraordinary in its own right. It was about the forest elephant. Not the species researchers expected to be most isolated. Not the one sitting at the edge of the known range. The forest elephant, living today in the dense equatorial forests of Central and West Africa, often overlooked in favor of its more visible savanna-dwelling relative, emerged from the most rigorous genomic analyses as something that may need to be understood in an entirely different category of evolutionary distinctiveness. The surprise was not that African elephants were different from each other. Scientists had long accepted that. The surprise was how different, and how long. The genome was not complicating the old story. It was revealing a far older one beneath it. Walk into the forest of the Congo Basin at first light. The canopy closes over you almost immediately, filtering the sky into a pale, diffuse green. The sounds are layered: insects, birds, the distant crack of something large moving through undergrowth. And somewhere ahead of you, if you are very quiet and very patient, is an animal that has been walking these forests for millions of years, longer, the data now suggests, than the entire span of our own genus. It moves without urgency, reading the landscape through its feet, through infrasound frequencies too low for human ears, through a social intelligence built across evolutionary time so deep it makes the span of recorded human civilization feel like a single afternoon. What lives in that forest is not a variant of the savanna elephant. It is, in the most precise biological sense, an ancient and entirely separate experiment in what it means to be an elephant. And we nearly missed that fact entirely. What the ancient genome is teaching us about elephants reaches beyond one species, beyond one continent, beyond one family tree. It is teaching us that the categories we impose on the living world, species, subspecies, lineage, type, are always approximations. They are the best words we have for describing the outcomes of processes that are older, messier, and more dynamic than our models tend to assume. Populations diverge. They survive in isolation. They meet again across corridors opened by climate and closed by geography. They exchange genes. They carry forward, in the architecture of their DNA, the memory of ancestors that no living eye will ever see and no fossil bed has yet revealed. The genome is not a clean record. It is a palimpsest, a document written over itself across millions of years, each layer faintly visible beneath the one above it. For elephants, reading that palimpsest has meant confronting the fact that what appeared to be a family of 3 survivors, the last remnants of a once vast radiation, is in reality something stranger and more intricate. The forest elephant is not simply a smaller version of the bush elephant. The divergences within Africa may be as old as the divergences that separate African from Asian lineages. And somewhere beneath the living genome, ghost populations persist as mathematical shadows, unnamed, unclassified, gone from the earth but not entirely erased. The story of elephant origins is not finished. The ancient DNA studies are still accumulating. Better preserved samples from tropical sites, advances in extraction technology, larger comparison panels. Each of these will sharpen the picture further. And each time the picture sharpens, the timeline tends to extend, the branches tend to multiply, and the clean narrative tends to give way to something more faithful to the actual complexity of life moving through geological time. We thought we understood the elephant's past. We had assembled the fossils, drawn the tree, named the lineages, and written the textbooks. And then the genome arrived and showed us that the textbooks were describing the surface of something vastly deeper. The elephant standing at that waterhole in the fading light is not just an animal. It is a library. And we are only beginning to learn how to read it. The map of elephant origins is still being drawn. And the most important discoveries it holds may be the ones that are not yet visible, waiting in a fragment of ancient bone, in a permafrost site not yet excavated, in a forest not yet surveyed. The genome keeps its secrets carefully. But it does keep them. And every time science finds a way to ask more precisely, the answer turns out to be older, more tangled, and more astonishing than the version that came before. Subscribe if you want to be here when the next answer arrives. Because in the science of ancient life, the next answer almost always rewrites the question.